Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ewan McNeil, and I'm the Director of Marketing at LMN. And I'd like you to welcome to the next in our LMN speaker series. Here at LMN, we're dedicated to helping landscape professionals build better businesses through our industry-leading software and education. Our speaker series is designed to bring you the best practices from experts around the world. Hopefully the weather wherever you are today is fantastic, even though our session today will focus on selling for snow and ice this upcoming season. Today's session, Creating a Sales Process That Actually Sells, will provide you with a blueprint for a repeatable sales process that will scale as your company grows. You'll learn which jobs to go after and which ones you will walk away from, how to select and set up contract types, why you need to establish a sales funnel for success, and so much more. You will leave this webinar excited to secure snow contracts for the upcoming season. Today's presenter is our own Director of Sales, Pete Dukeson. Pete has been with LMN for just over 4 years, and our existing customers who've interacted on chat will know him as Spider-Man. In his role at LMN, Pete has facilitated hundreds of workshops and on-site implementations with thousands of green and snow contractors across North America. It is this industry experience and passion that Pete has distilled into today's presentation. Just some housekeeping before we start. We saved some time at the end for questions. So please hold on to them or ask them through the dialog box at the right-hand corner in your chat window. If we can't get to your question at the end, we'll be sure to have Pete reach out with an answer after the webinar. Without further ado, over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Ewan. So again, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Today's topic we'll be covering is creating a sales process that actually sells. So without further ado, we will jump into the presentation. So for those who are joining the webinar today and have not heard of LMN, yes, we are a software solution for the landscape and snow industries. LMN was built by landscapers for both the landscape and the snow and ice industry. But aside from helping contractors with their software needs, over the past decade, LMN has worked hand in hand with numerous landscape associations, including NALP and SIMA, just to name a couple, on being an industry leader in the educational space as well. We've hosted hundreds of business management workshops, teaching thousands of contractors, and have covered all aspects of how to run a better landscape and snow and ice business. Today's webinar will focus strictly on the sales process and hope to shed some light on this area of your business. So in terms of the agenda and topics that we're going to be covering today, we'll talk about your market segment, specifically what type of prospects you should be targeting and which ones are ideal for you. Next, we'll dive into the common contract types being used in the industry today, followed by your sales funnel and why this process should be mandatory for every successful landscape company. Then we'll take a look at quote presentation and some important things to keep in mind at this stage of your sales process. And lastly, we'll end on an exercise covering cost per acquisition, as this is often a topic that some contractors are not too familiar with. So in terms of your market segment, just one thing to keep in mind here is all prospects are not created equal. At our business management workshops, we often hear contractors facing the dilemma of not wanting to turn down work, whether it be to financial constraints or keeping their workforce busy all year round, or simply not knowing whether that prospect is going to be a profit generator or a loss leader. But before we jump into some key considerations, let's take a look at the typical snow prospect. So in terms of the common snow prospects that we typically interface with, so the residential sites, commercial, HOAs, industrial, government, retail, I mean, for the most part, all snow and ice contractors are interfacing with the same type of prospect. But just one bucket that we want to bring into mind here is contracts that are typically just snow only, or you might even have contracts that could be potentially year-round business for you. So aside from site specificity, you should also keep in mind with respect to whether they're just going to be a snow and ice customer or potentially a year-round contract, or even within your own funnel of existing or new clients, whether or not these are people that you're going to potentially upsell to as well. So for example, you have a current maintenance contract or you do design build for them, but you might not have the snow side of their business. The only thing that we typically tend to see here though is any lead a good lead? Now, there are some key considerations that we need to keep in mind because oftentimes we find ourselves spreading ourselves too thin as snow and ice contractors. So typically what we like to say is find your niche, find that market that you can own and be the experts in. But there are some key things that you need to keep in mind before you can even go about that. Need to know their preferred contract type. So this serves as a benefit for both you and your prospect. As a contractor, if you have certain contract types that you have a preference for, so for example, you typically have been dealing in seasonal contracts or per push or T&M, then you might want to align yourself with prospects who have that same preference. Oftentimes, this is based on geography or climate, especially with areas that are high volume of precipitation. They tend to favor seasonal contracts versus areas of low precipitation where T&M might be king. You may encounter a prospect who will request for multiple contract types, and trying to find the best deal, then you must be prepared to give them these options. But we'll dive further into this later. The other thing you need to think about is equipment and labor needs. So in terms of each prospect, each type of job site you're dealing with can vary drastically in terms of your equipment or labor needs. A wide open industrial lot versus an HOA with hundreds of driveways and walkways have completely different requirements in terms of what you would need to be equipped to service that type of site. You need to ensure that you are already equipped with this type of fleet or equipment, or you have the means to be equipped with this type of equipment, whether it be through rentals or subcontractors for the coming season. Staffing is another variable you must not forget. If you start bidding and winning residential jobs or jobs with lots of sidewalk shoveling, then you need to make sure you've got the processes in play to find the labor to do the work. Another thing you need to keep in mind is the timing of service requirements. If a new prospect has strict requirements in terms of when they need to be serviced, so a hospital that's open 24/7 with zero tolerance versus a business complex that doesn't open until 7 a.m. Monday to Friday, you need to ensure that this falls within the scope of your current fleet, route, and/or staffing. Site location. This should be obvious, but cannot be ignored. If a prospect falls outside of your current route, the additional time it would take to send a crew to that job site might not make sense from an efficiency perspective. So the key takeaway that you'd want to take away from this market segment here is that snow and ice contractors typically define their main market segment or segments by having laser-focused precision and with the right equipment and staff to be experts in that niche. While it does take discipline to turn down work, it pays off in the long run, as accounts that don't fit in your market segment could be siphoning profit from your bottom line. The next topic we'll jump into are contract types. Some key things to consider when presenting these options. We'll make sure that we drive through them here. You want to make sure that you're identifying your preferred contract type for your prospect in order to make sure that you have the increased likelihood of closing that deal. So in general terms, we can bucket the typical snow and ice contracts into one of these four segments. So seasonal or monthly contracts could just be for the winter months or potentially a year-round contract with maintenance in the spring, summer. Contractors will typically use historical averages in terms of snow or salting events to come up with an all-in price for the season. And on the topic of all-inclusive, we typically have many variables and thresholds or stipulations that can be added on to cover additional services if needed. Now, without going through every single bullet point there, the one thing I want you to appreciate here is that this type of contract style can have many clauses and many stipulations, often sometimes where this might be a lot of jargon for both you and your prospect to have to sift through. Another common contract type is per event or per inch, where typically you'd lay out some sort of a threshold and agree in terms of here's the price in terms of the service being rendered. And then lastly, T&M. So we've seen a growing trend in T&M over the years. It looks like contractors and prospects are now trying to work out essentially being billed for events where they're just only being billed for when work is being provided. And that's probably the last contract style we'll cover here. But before you can even begin to sell yourself and present options, you need to understand your prospect. So their past contract type. Take the time to sit down and understand what their current contract style is right now. Because at the end of the day, before you can even pitch and say, this is what we'll be able to offer you, you need to understand what their current style is. Do they have a preference? Is there a certain billing style that they've had in the past that maybe their current provider is not providing? Did they have a preference towards per push or per event versus all-in contracts? Were they satisfied with their current caps that they have on saltings? Whatever the case may be, this is when you would sit down and take the time to make sure that you understand what works or doesn't work for your prospect, and make sure that you have the proper ammunition to be able to come back and say, this is what we can provide you. The other thing that you must keep in mind is whether or not this could be a year-round contract. More often than not, companies will come back with different pricing in terms of, am I going to land a maintenance contract, or maybe put me in the door for install projects for the spring, summer, and they'll keep this factor in mind when it comes to pricing out their job for the winter. So that's another question that you need to surface with your prospect as well. So in terms of contract types, again, just being able to understand and know what your prospect is looking for, and then being able to increase your chances of closing that deal by presenting something that makes sense for them or falls within their wheelhouse of comfort. The next thing we'll jump into is a pretty big process that every company should have some sort of semblance in their company right now, which is their sales funnel. Whether it be organized into a software platform or on a spreadsheet or neatly stacked sticky notes all over their desk, having a formalized sales funnel is what separates the top performers from the pack. So why is having a sales funnel important? Stack ranking. So without knowing where your prospects land in your funnel, it's impossible to have a focused follow-up or outreach plan. You could potentially be wasting valuable time chasing down cold or dead leads when you should be focusing on prospects with a greater likelihood to close. Streamlining. Especially for owner-operators who handles all of the selling, keeping track of your leads may be manageable up to a certain point, but the moment you introduce additional employees, especially salespeople, you must have streamlined sales funnels to ensure everyone is on the same page when interacting with prospects. By eliminating subjectivity, you foster an environment that aligns your employees with a system that is repeatable and teachable. Accountability. The other aspect you introduce is this. By giving your employees a streamlined system and process, you are able to keep your employees honest by ensuring they adhere to this process. To get your employees to buy in, have them sit down with you in the process of building this funnel together as a team. That way, everybody has input in terms of designing the structure to make sure that everybody understands and knows what is expected of them. Lastly, you introduce insight into your company by now being able to forecast and plan for success, especially during the winter months where contractors most likely need to plan ahead for equipment, whether that be rentals or subs or labor. And you want to make sure that you have a forecast into this insight to make sure you have that plan for success. Here's an example of what your sales funnel could look like. Now, bear in mind, this is just for illustrative purposes, and your funnel could have less steps or more and have different verbiage. The only word of caution here is to try not to overcomplicate your process by having too many steps. Remember, the golden rule, less is more. During the winter time is probably the best time to prospect and generate leads. And whether you know it or not, your best sources of intel are your employees. Especially where adjacent or nearby lots are owned by your competition, have your employees keep an eye out for certain things. How often their sites are getting serviced, any gaps in their current service provided, for example, over or under salting, damage to property, are they being serviced in a timely fashion during or the beginning of an event? All of this information could serve as ammunition for you and when you reach out to this prospect to sell your services. And typically during the winter months, that's when you would want to start making sure you keep an eye out for these extra things. The next stage of your sales process ideally would be something that we already covered earlier, which is pretty much getting to know your prospect, or more importantly, qualifying them. You always want to make sure you are qualifying your prospect to ensure that they are the right type of lead for you. If they do not fit your criteria and are not a qualified lead, take them out of your sales funnel and move on to the next one. Again, there's no point trying to chase down leads that aren't going to give you a better likelihood of closing that deal. The next stage, we've identified this as fact finding, is critical, as this is where you will gain more insight into your prospect. to increase your chances of landing their business. This is where the bulk of your time may be spent in an actual meeting, face-to-face interactions, or on-site time to ensure you learn as much as you can and why they're looking to switch service providers. More often than not, the prospect will air all of their grievances, but if they don't be hesitant to ask why they want to bring that to the surface. At the end of the day, you want as much information in your back pocket to be able to put you in a better position to get their business. After fact finding, it's time to sell. But you're selling by educating your prospect by showcasing how you will fit their needs and how you stack against your competitors. Every snow and ice provider will say the same thing. If it snows, we'll be there. We are 24/7 full service. We've been in business for X amount of years. But this is your opportunity to stand out and shine from the stack. Showcase your assets. Some companies will highlight how often they service their equipment or turn over their fleet every 2 years, etc., which to your prospect can be understood as being reliable and punctual. Showcase items like your software stack, as in the technology that your company utilizes to ensure that your high standards are delivered upon each and every time, whether that be through digital sitemaps, instant job tracking through a customer portal, or live to the minute updates on service progress. And lastly, provide referrals. Oftentimes, your best selling tool is the feedback you get from your own client base. If you're having a difficult time getting your own customers to be referrals, you can offer incentives or credits towards their account for every new prospect they help close. As discussed before, prospects may feel inundated with the plethora of options and contracts that they feel during their exploration phase when looking for a service provider. Keep things simple. At the end of the day, they want to be able to understand what's being presented to them. And whether you have 1 or 2 contract styles that work best for you, or maybe even 3, just make sure that you have a standardized flow in terms of this is what you present, and we don't have jargon that might be confusing to your client. And again, understanding context and knowing what their past contracts that they currently are being used with is something that you should have in your back pocket to make sure that you're aware of all the information you have. And ensure you have some sort of a dedicated follow-up process. So whether that be a specific month or week or a set number of days or a deadline, ensure you stay on top of all of your leads. Remember, your leads are just as busy as you are. Ensure that you're speaking with the decision maker. Gatekeepers or anyone else that stand in the way of the actual person who will sign on the dotted line introduces a barrier that could either delay the sales process or crush it entirely. And lastly, know when to walk away. With a bulletproof estimating system, you should be able to know your costs, your margins, your break evens, and if that prospect comes back with numbers that don't make sense to you, walk away. So your sales funnel is a critical piece for every successful snow and ice company. In fact, we believe in it so much that it's something that we give away in our free package. If you're currently not an Element subscriber today, check out our webpage to learn more details on how our free package could benefit you. The next thing we're going to jump into is quote presentation. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise, but when dealing with contracts for snow and ice, there must be some careful consideration when delivering quotes to your prospects. So some key things to consider. While we don't deep dive into the legal jargon, legalese into this webinar today, just understand that it's in everyone's best interest, especially yourself as a service provider, to ensure that you have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. A contract lawyer specializes in this, especially those specifically working hand in hand with the snow and ice industry. Ensure that you have a lawyer review your contracts and make sure that they get their approval to ensure that this is something that can be presented to your prospects. Another commonly brought term here is having your insurance company review them as well. The last thing you want is to have a signed document floating around there that won't be backed by your insurance provider, thus making it null and void in their eyes. Protect yourself through sitemaps. So that common adage of a picture says 1,000 words, and in this case could save you millions. Have clear site maps that show and state where you are providing service, clearly outlined with colors and images to make sure that in case of litigation, you have yourself backed up in documents to say, we provide service in these areas or in areas where you don't provide service. The other aspect you can have here is have your prospect sign on that as well too. So now you have everyone's signatures and initials on it so that in case something were to happen, at least now all parties are involved and signed off saying that this is what we agreed upon. Put a deadline or clause stating that this contract is only valid for X number of days. The last thing you want is a prospect coming back to you mid-season saying they would like you to honor the agreement that you sent out to them in the summer, but you're already booked up for the season. And last but not least, if rejected by your insurance company, have a clause in there stating so that this proposal is no longer valid. Your customer doesn't care about any mistake you made or any issues that you had over a technicality. So save yourself the hassle and potential lost business and revenue by making sure that this is a stated clause in your contract. Our last topic will cover cost per acquisition. So for those who aren't familiar with this term, in its essence, you're trying to determine the value of your marketing resources, either as a whole or for a particular source, as a function of sales. Ideally, you want this ratio to be as low as possible, which means you're spending as little money to gain new customers. So we'll walk through an exercise to cover what this means to you. So in terms of cost per acquisition, you want to make sure that you have a trackable list of referral sources. So at the end of the day, you want to know where your leads are coming from. So whether they're from truck signage, online, or just straight calling into your company, you want to make sure that you're able to track this to ensure that you know what your ROI are on your referral sources. This also allows you to pivot and know what's working or not. If you are spending money in your online campaigns, or if you're spending a lot of dollars on job site signage, but you're not seeing the ROI that you wish to get, then you want to make sure that you double down on areas that are working for your company. This is an often overlooked area here, but with technology nowadays, most companies now have some sort of a website or maybe a Facebook page, if not a website. But try and separate yourself by having a dedicated snow and ice landing page. Instead of having just a bullet point saying that, yes, we also offer snow and ice, take the time to build a separate area on your website to say that you are a snow and ice provider, because this will separate you from your other competitors who may not have that on their site right now. And the art of cold calling. So as much as we all like to talk about prospecting and gaining new leads, if you don't like the idea of cold calling, then maybe we should look into someone else that can do that for us. Cold calling is something that's gotten a bad rap over the years, but we'll walk through a quick exercise to show you how even just one phone call could make or break many companies. So this cold call scenario, let's say a typical cold call. You call a prospect, you end up getting them on the phone, you gain their interest. And within about 15 minutes or so, you now have yourself set up for a face-to-face meeting. Now, this isn't going to happen in one meeting. It might make multiple meetings in terms of closing this deal, but let's just say on average, all in all, we spend a few hours on these meetings face-to-face. Now, let's say we're at the stage now where we're ready to build out a contract or a proposal for this prospect. You're back at your shop, whatever current system you're using right now. Let's say it takes about an hour to develop that contract. So there's an hour sunk in there. And then all the time spent in terms of going back and forth, driving to the client, maybe even taking them out for lunch or whatever the case may be, we'll factor some sort of an unbillable time in there. So let's say all in, we're about 6.25 hours into this deal. Now, let's just fast forward and assume we win this deal. Let's say the typical contract value for this client ends up being $20,000 a season. Let's say we do great work and we keep this contract valid for 5 years. We're looking at a lifetime value of about 100,000. And then in terms of the time we spent to gain that 100,000 at 6.25 hours, that's a pretty good return on investment in terms of how much time you spent just to land that deal. Now that essentially wraps up today's webinar in terms of the topics that we covered. Again, the presentation will be shared for everyone that joined the webinar today. If you aren't currently an LMN subscriber, check out our webpage here, the golmn.com/your-plan. This is a scorecard where you can go and answer 6 simple questions to get an idea of where LMN fits for you in your business. And without further ado, we can open up the forum for questions and answers.
Thanks, Pete. Great presentation there. I think the depth and breadth of the material you cover will provide the attendees with lots to consider for the upcoming season. Just remind folks, if you do have questions, go ahead and ask them now at this point. We do have some questions in the queue, so I'm going to take the first one here, Pete. The first one is from Patrick, and it's, you mentioned employing the use of sales funnel/pipeline. Do you recommend any specific CRM or other software to manage your account lists?
Thanks, Patrick. That's actually a really good question. Depending on how comfortable you are with utilizing software, we often see most businesses start simple, whether that's spreadsheets, Word documents, or even their email provider like Outlook, for example. If you feel you've outgrown those processes and are looking for a more robust system, then yes, there are standalone CRM or client relationship management tools that might be in your wheelhouse in terms of your next steps. That being said, I did mention earlier, we do have our free package for you to check out. We have built in a CRM there as well, no commitment, no payments, no contract, but we've built it with the landscaper in mind. And it's a free tool for you to be able to track your pipeline, track your leads, and just keep all your dialogue all in one place.
Perfect. Next question is from Ed, and Ed asks, I'm a relatively small snow company, 3 trucks. Just do it to stay busy year round. I struggle with finding the time to prospect and look for new snow leads because it always feels like we're busy all year round. What advice can you offer?
Thanks, Ed. I did mention earlier a suggestion that came through from one of our workshops that I actually attended. What he mentioned is he had his employees at that time, they were just using clipboards and paper route sheets. He had a separate sheet that he would have his employees fill out any sort of intel that they could on adjacent lots. He even turned this into a game where he even incentivized his employees, where whoever gave the most intel on a prospect and they eventually turned into customers, he would actually incentivize them with a bonus system. And that's something that you can employ for your company as well.
Great. Looks like we have one more question. Again, folks, if you have any more questions, feel free to ask those at this point. Susan has asked, the last example you gave from that cold calling scenario, is cold calling really still a thing that contractors are doing?
That's a great question. With the advancements in tech, social media, better websites, blogs, video content, there are many additional resources in terms of trying to channel, what's the best ROI for you. That being said, cold calling is still something that exists. It's something that shouldn't really ever disappear from your sales process. Now, it may not serve as your primary generator for leads, but at the end of the day, if you need to backfill, or if you see that the number of leads coming to you are not as high or as quality as you'd like, cold calling is definitely another opportunity for you to backfill the funnels that you have in your current funnel. And again, whether that's you or you hire a part-timer or somebody seasonal to do this role, try and get somebody that's super energetic and likes to talk to people, and that could end up being a good ROI for you.
Well, I put out another call. I have not seen any more questions come in. So Pete, I do want to thank you again for the fantastic presentation. You provided lots of detail and things for folks to think about here. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I encourage you to go to our speaker session area of the site. That's golmn.com/speaker-session to check out our upcoming sessions. We do have a session in September and in October. You can check out there and have you sign up for that. And I wish everyone a very, very successful snow season. Thank you very much. Have a great day.